Going for a short stroll in the forest sounds like a lovely time, but for a Viking prisoner, the offer of a walk could promise a whole world of pain. Vikings were brutal people and did inflict serious levels of torture on their captives, from imprisonment on board their ships to a life of slavery in the barren wastes of Greenland. However, the sagas also seem to tell of a number of brutal execution methods employed by the Vikings. The infamous Blood Eagle, but also hung meat, and the one we're exploring in this video, the Fatal Walk. Welcome to the Viking Vault. What? Very simply, the Fatal Walk was a Viking torture method that invariably led to the victim's death. Their stomach was sliced open, and the Viking torturer would reach inside their torso and fish out a little bit of their intestine and keep a good grip on it. The victim was then forced to walk around a tree until their entire intestinal tract was wrapped around the trunk. We don't have much textual evidence for this practice though, with only a few references to the Fatal Walk dating back to the Viking times. The main source that most people think of when talking about the Fatal Walk comes from Njal's saga, an impressive depiction of the Icelandic view of heroes and their general daily lives. The main character is Njal, a wise and level-headed man who can somehow see the future. In this saga, a Viking mercenary named Brewer is the unfortunate victim of this horrific torture method. Responsible for the death of the Irish king Brian Boru after the Battle of Clontarf, Brewer is described as a man who abandoned his faith and instead turned to sorcery. Brewer was also known as a fierce warrior and slaughtered many of his opponents during the battle, only to run away after being attacked by an amazingly named warrior, Wulf the Quarrelsome. Wulf, or Ulf, was so strong that he beat Brewer back, forcing him to flee. Brewer's cowardice broke his men's morale, and the Viking army began to fall apart. And in all this, where was the High King Brian? The Irish monarch was getting on in years and had followed the good advice to stay off the battlefield. While waiting for news as to the outcome of the battle, it seems that Brian was betrayed by someone in his camp who pointed Brewer in the right direction. How Brewer killed Brian is not known, but in Njal's saga it seems that Brewer felled the king and then called out, quote, "Now let man tell man that Brewer felled Brian." Immediately after hearing the death of the king, messengers ran to warn the army and get help. In peak medieval Viking fashion, Brian's forces had been routing the enemy and chasing down the Vikings as they were trying to escape. Once the messengers caught up to the tail end of the Irish host and made them aware of the plight of their king, two warriors turned back to avenge his death: Wulf the Quarrelsome and a man named Curthiolfad. Wulf was the one who'd intimidated Brewer during the battle earlier that day, and it just so happened that he was Brian's brother. Brewer was heading for a whole world of hurt as Wulf didn't take the news of his brother's death well. Returning to the camp, Wulf and Curthiolfad captured Brewer and his men, leading to this delightful description in Njal's saga, quote, "Wulf the Quarrelsome cut open his belly and led him round and round the trunk of a tree, and so wound all his entrails out of him. And he did not die before they were all drawn out of him." Brewer's men were slain to a man. How likely? Although we've seen in the movies where a wounded soldier will be found slumped over, entrails in his hands, still alive despite the horrific injuries done to him, how likely is it that someone would have been able to withstand the Fatal Walk? Well, a human can survive for a really long time after being disemboweled, up to several hours. That is, if the blood loss and shock doesn't finish the victim off in a far shorter period of time. So would Wulf's treatment of Brewer have kept him alive? It's unlikely, since Wulf would have not been operating on Brewer with any sort of care or precision. It's likely that the incision into Brewer's stomach would have been inflicted by an axe or a sword, meaning that it would have sliced through more than just skin and muscle, but probably cut open some of Brewer's internal organs. Next up, Wulf needed to reach into the cut and pull out a loop of intestine that he could hook around the tree. It's pretty far-fetched to think that anyone would be able to stand at that point and start walking around a tree to unwind his guts into the dirt. Evidence. Well, unsurprisingly, there isn't a lot of evidence for the Fatal Walk. As we've said earlier, it's a torture method that only really appears in one contemporary text, Njal's saga. In terms of archaeological or historical evidence, the fact that the executioner would only be cutting into soft tissue means that no trace of such a method will exist in the modern era. Normally, archaeological evidence for the cause of death comes from the bones. For example, we can tell if someone died violently because their skeleton will show the damage. Soft tissue only survives in very specific circumstances. Think boggy peatlands that preserve skin and other tissues. So our evidence needs to come from other sources which are thin on the ground for the Fatal Walk. There is one other piece of textual evidence that mentions the Fatal Walk, a text titled The Tale of Ormstolfsson. This piece of writing dates from a few centuries after the generally accepted end of the Viking Age, probably being written down in the mid to late 14th century. The titular Ormr is a typical Viking child hero, massively strong but also incredibly willful, who gets up to all sorts of heroic adventures. The tale of Ormstolfsson is interesting in that it's composed both as poetry and prose, which lends weight to the idea that a lot of the ideas contained within it were borrowed from other existing literary works, most notably Eagle's Saga. There is one key difference between Eagle's Saga and the tale of Ormstolfsson though, and that's the inclusion of the Fatal Walk. The story goes that Ormr and his friend Asbjorn travel around as young men, adventuring and swearing to take vengeance for each other if anyone hurts them. They part ways after a time, with Asbjorn deciding he wants to follow stories of a giant king called Brucey who ate human flesh and couldn't be beaten by mortal men. Orm doesn't want to get involved with the giant and his massive cat mother, which don't worry about that too much, that's just typical Viking stuff. So Asbjorn travels to the giant's kingdom with a few of his men. Most of the men die quickly at the teeth of the giant's mother, but Asbjorn makes it all the way to Brucey's cave. At this point, Asbjorn realizes that he should have taken everything much more seriously, as he's quickly subdued by the giant who decides that he wants to see if Asbjorn is any tougher than the other men. In a truly heroic manner, Asbjorn not only withstands the torture without screaming or running away, but he is actually able to recite 10 verses of poetry whilst being forced to walk around unspooling his intestines. The big difference between the depiction of the Fatal Walk in Jarl's Saga and the tale of Ormstolfsson is the victim. In Jarl's Saga, Bruir is an apostate Viking who abandoned his Christian faith and turned to sorcery. In the tale of Ormstolfsson, the Fatal Walk is a heroic feat undertaken by a true hero, Asbjorn the Courteous. This is where something called hagiography, or the writing of saints' lives, comes in. Most of the textual records for Viking history were actually written down by monks and other clerical scholars in the centuries following the Viking Age, which naturally comes with a hint of Christian morality. A lot of the clergy at this point were used to writing the lives of the saints and leaning on hagiographical motifs in their writing. While there are only 2 references to the Fatal Walk in Viking literature, the first mention of it in Christian writing actually seems to predate Jarl's Saga, which was written in the late 13th century. There are a couple of similar sounding tortures in other medieval writings, like the Gesta Danorum, where Baltic pirates are exceeded by having their intestines wound around a wooden log or a windlass. Other saints' lives talk about this torture method in England before it crossed the ocean to Norway. The first time the Fatal Walk appears is in an early text that talks about the death of Alfred Aetheling, son of Ethelred the Unready and brother of Edward the Confessor. In this 12th century historical text, it says that Alfred was taken to Ely, where he was blinded before having his stomach sliced and his large intestine pulled out. After this, Alfred was goaded to walk round and round a stake until he fell to the floor and died. This isn't the only time that disemboweling is used in hagiography. Evisceration was quite a common motif in medieval writings that pretty much guaranteed saintly suffering and a first-class ticket to heaven. This is completely in contrast to Bruir in Jarl's Saga. Bruir is forced into this punishment by a later Christian writer who wants to show that pagans will be punished for the crime of not believing in God. Outro. While it's impossible to argue that Vikings were lovely, civilized people, it's fascinating to find that some of the most gruesome atrocities attached to them may have actually come from Christian propaganda. It's particularly notable that none of the other historical records that talk about the Battle of Clontarf recorded Bruir's evisceration. And it's even been suggested that Bruir isn't a real Norse name and is instead a corruption of an Irish name. Torture in the sagas always has to be taken with a grain of salt, as we never have real evidence as to whether it actually happened or not. While the Blood Eagle is far more famous and probably far less plausible, the Fatal Walk has the horrific possibility that somebody could have survived this method of execution for far longer. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a fantastic week. Cheers!